Now this morning, Congressman Nathaniel Moran of Tyler told me he finds Matt Gaetz to be a surprising pick for Attorney General. He believes Gaetz must be fully vetted before becoming the nation's chief law enforcement officer.
The timing of his resignation from the House of Representatives clearly was meant to prevent the public disclosure of the ethics report, and I think that ultimately that report will want to be seen by the United States senators. If I was a senator, I'd want to see that report too, to see exactly what the determination was by the ethics committee. It had been studying the issues and the allegations for a couple of years, and that's really important. First, to give transparency to the process, and also to give surety that whoever ends up in our top law enforcement office is the person we need there. It's the same standard that we would apply to a Democratic nominee, and I think we need to uphold that standard even to Republican nominees.
And Congressman, I want to ask you about recess appointments. It's been discussed over the past week or so. They're nothing new. The first president of the United States, George Washington, he had recess appointments. Presidents from both parties have had recess appointments ever since. But when it comes to someone like Matt Gaetz, where there are these allegations, very serious allegations, do you think he's someone who should, his confirmation, go before the Senate instead of a recess appointment?
I think it absolutely should have full vetting of the United States Senate with their advice and their consent and ultimately their stamp of approval if he is to be the top law enforcement officer of this nation. I would say that about any of the top nominees, and certainly I would say that if it was a Democratic president that's making Democratic picks, there needs to be a full vetting of the people that are going to be at the top of our executive agencies that are going to be doing the bidding of the United States president. We need to know that these folks are indeed the folks that need to be in those positions, and that requires a full Senate hearing and a full Senate discussion.
Congressman Moran believes lawmakers must impart the same standard to these nominees as they would for nominees of any president.